Yes.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Happy to. Really happy when you asked me to have this conversation because then I was like, oh, I'm going to read this book and then I'm going to hear something about it. This book on Saraha, is not someone I was familiar with before I read it. This is, Tibetan Buddhism is not an area of extensive study by me. But, really enjoyed both the sections where you talk about the numerous texts and kind of outline themes, which enables you to really take in what this body of text is about in terms of practice. And then the translations themselves are just so beautiful and lyrical. They're often called songs. They feel song-like, although they're pretty trippy. Anyway, we'll get to hear, I think, some readings from them. So anyway, thank you so much for doing this. And I'm going to start with a question for you.
Okay.
Why do you think we need a book about Saraha, or why did you choose to write this book?
Well, the honest truth is I was asked to write it by Shambhala Publications, but I had done some previous work on, people can hear me okay, I assume. I'd done some previous work on Saraha, so there's maybe like 10 people in the world who work on this guy. And, I guess I was one of them. I'm probably the least qualified of anybody to do this book, but I said yes. And but that's of course the cheap and dirty answer. I've been reading Saraha probably for 55 years. I first, when I was an undergraduate at Wesleyan in the late 60s, early 70s, I came across a copy. Actually, it didn't belong to me, I realized, but I returned it to the guy who I think is still living, George Kurth. Anyway, he's got his name in the front. What the karma of that is. Anyway, I got this book called The Royal Song of Saraha, translated by Herbert Gunther, a great Tibetologist of an earlier generation. And I found it really appealing in the kind of cultural context in which I was living in the late 60s, particularly because I fancy myself a mystic and I fancy myself a poet. And here was a mystic poet, clearly, and what's more, it was a mystic poet who had a really rebellious streak. He was incredibly critical of all sorts of social institutions, religious institutions. Conceptual mind in general was really not his favorite thing. I'll be honest, I was much more drawn to Zen at that point in my life and didn't know that I would end up kind of wandering into the realms of Tibetan Buddhism. But there's definitely, Ben must have felt this in reading, especially the translations, that there's resonances between the kind of thing you find in the kind of discourse and rhetoric you find in Zen and what you find in Saraha. So that was an important part of that. There was part of me that I think thought of Saraha as kind of a proto-beat poet, and just sort of, he's free, he does what he wants. This is the 19-year-old me speaking, okay, so please be slightly indulgent. Anyway, whatever the appeal of Saraha in the West, and I think there's something to the similarity in the appeal of Zen, at least the initial appeal of Zen in the West. It's something that cuts through cultural differences, kind of tells you to directly look at the nature of your mind. Again, I'm oversimplifying all of this, obviously, but I think for people who find getting into the religious practices of a different culture from ours kind of off-putting and difficult seeming, Saraha seems to have this directness and freshness the same way that many of the Zen masters that I was reading alongside Saraha seem to have. But of course, you begin to dig a little more and you realize, this is actually a very important person in the history of Asian Buddhism, because I did eventually end up kind of linking up above all with the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I quickly discovered that Saraha was somebody who is considered to be perhaps the greatest of the 84 great tantric adepts, the Mahasiddhas, who were these Indian figures of the last centuries of the first millennium. They're the the kind of quintessential tantric practitioners, the same way that like an arhat is the quintessential, say, Theravada practitioner, or a bodhisattva is the quintessential Mahayana practitioner. The Mahasiddhas are seen, especially in Tibetan tradition, as being the really exemplary tantric practitioners. But the stories of the Mahasiddhas and the songs of the Mahasiddhas are, they can be a little strange at times. The stories are full of wonders and miracles. The songs are full of paradox and sometimes are clearly antinomian, transgressive, critical, while at the same time celebrating, the basic purity and luminosity of the mind. And the other thing for the Tibetan tradition is that Saraha is regarded as the sort of human fountainhead of the lineages, the traditions surrounding the Great Seal, or Mahamudra, which is one of the great, along with the Great Perfection, and there's many others, of course, but the Great Perfection, or Dzogchen, and Mahamudra are two Tibetan practices that, at least on the face of it, have, again, this kind of directness, some social critique, and definitely a celebration of the purity of the mind. So very important figure in Tibetan tradition. He also in Tibet was the kind of inspiration, not directly, but at least indirectly, for the whole tradition of spiritual songs in Tibet, which is something that any Tibetan Lama worth his or her salt writes or sings spontaneously, as the case may be. So Saraha is kind of the poetic root of a lot of what happens in Tibet. But then you go back to India, which is where Saraha supposedly was from, right? Here we have, you could almost say that his importance for the Tantra tradition rivals that of a figure like Nagarjuna for the Mahayana philosophical tradition. He's got that kind of stature. There were commentaries written in India, within a generation of his lifetime, it seems, and quite a number of them. And he's the whole critical spirit that Saraha brings against social critique, religious critique, critique of arid scholasticism. All this became a kind of inspiration, even after Buddhism more or less disappeared from India. It became an inspiration for groups way outside the Buddhist tradition. For instance, the Sants, who are largely Hindu, but we could describe them as almost interdenominational. A figure like Kabir, who many of you will have heard of and even read, is very much in a similar spirit to Saraha. He's also important because he and others of the Mahasiddhas, these great tantric adepts in India, form a linguistic bridge between kind of classical Sanskrit and the modern vernaculars, Hindi, Bengali, Gujarati, whatever it may be. The Indian text that we have by Saraha the text we have by Saraha in an Indian language, Apabhrangsha in this case, are definitely precursors of what we find in the modern Indian languages. Yet you can see the Sanskritic elements of them as well. There's also a kind of legacy in oral performance. These songs may have been oral, some of them originally, we don't really know, but if you've heard of figures like the Bauls of Bengal, who are these kind of wandering singers in Bengal, or for that matter, some of the Newars in the Kathmandu Valley, they're directly taking the kind of, at least the rhythms, the overall outlook of people like Saraha. So it's, even though Buddhism disappeared in India effectively a long time ago, the echoes that you hear are very much there. Finally, just to bring it back around to my own initial attraction to it, I think that was 50 odd years ago, and while I hope I've gained a little bit in perspective on and my own rather overly romanticized reactions to a figure like this, which again typical of that era and perhaps of anybody who's 19. I think that the things that make Saraha continue to be important are the sort of two faces, right? The critical face that doesn't necessarily take religion for granted, and is willing to criticize institutions and practices that he thinks miss the point. And the point is that we recognize directly, experience, don't just think about or talk about, experience the pure nature of our mind. That's a little longer as usual, because I have a professorial tendency to do that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I think I'm as kind of nerdy. I'm just, when you're talking about the song element, recalling, there's really nice passages looking at the way the Sanskritic and the Tibetan use different elements of poetic technique to create,
Yeah.
and how translators had to move between those forms to preserve a sense of song, and then to read yours, which carry with an English vernacular this kind of sweetness and flowing character. Really beautiful. So I have this, oh, I was hoping you would read something. So I have this idea of reading a little passage from the Ornament of Springtime.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, this is, I won't say anything about this before reading it.
The 349.
Thank you, yeah, I do have it marked. Now, this is short enough that I can read the whole thing, okay? This is called Ornament of Springtime, a Doha Treasury song. Okay, what they used to be. I prostrate to the glorious Heruka, I, a youth, who sees the flowers of spring, the pomegranate, the three bodies, and other delights. I'm intoxicated. Desiring Heruka, I say, here, at the very beginning of spring, please be my protector, and don't let me die of passion. May I enjoy sweet-smelling Ambakaruna flowers. The Sharipa, it is said, beats his drum. The Chandali carries the lamp, and the master painter descends. I hope the young man will come now at the beginning of spring. May you be my protector, and don't let me die of passion. Looking in the 10 directions, I don't see anything but you. And in the fire of my passion, I don't even think of my own body. Through our prayers to the 4 transmission yoginis, may the Blessed One be roused. So this is an interesting and pretty unusual song in Saraha's corpus. One of the things that you notice, I mean, it's fairly obvious that Saraha is male, but the voice here, as I read it, is female. He's imagining himself a young woman in springtime. The Heruka, to whom he refers, she refers, is a kind of wrathful form of the Buddha, very important in tantric traditions. And elsewhere, Saraha refers to himself as a devotee of Heruka. So there's clearly that kind of tantric reference. There are some references in here that are totally obscure, and nobody who has read or translated this poem has any idea what they're talking about. That's partly why I just left a couple of Sanskrit words in there. It's just, we don't really know what the master painter descending refers to. But I think it's less the particulars of it than the kind of overall tone. It's a love poem of a sort that you don't actually see that much in Buddhism. You do see it in Hindu traditions a lot, bhakti poetry, devotional poetry, where the poet will sing, will sometimes take the persona of Radha, the consort of Krishna, singing to Krishna. Or there's the great figure of what's his name? Sorry. Anyway, I lost his name. But there's a great Surdas, a great blind Hindu poet of the 16th or 17th century, who in many of his poems takes on again a female persona to sing about his love for the Lord. So so there's this is sort of a particular genre. The other reason I kind of selected this as one that Ben might pick out, and apart from the fact that it's just so unusual and I love it, is that it's one of the very few poems where Saraha, in any form, seems to give us anything autobiographical. Again, it's in a very indirect way. How much this really tells us about Saraha, the person, I'm not sure. But part of the reason for highlighting it is that it just makes the point, and I won't go into all the details of this, but makes the point that we know nothing about this guy, really. People are guessing that he probably lived in the 10th century, probably in North India, probably in the area that's now Bihar and or Bengal, which was patronized by the Pala monarchs and it was a great, sort of the last great dynasty to support Buddhism in India. And he probably lived in that context, but all the biographies, so-called, that we have of Saraha they're either very late Indian or more likely just Tibetan. And there's very little connection at all. I should mention that the name Saraha means the archer, someone who shoots an arrow, or perhaps makes an arrow, little ambiguous. So there were stories that came up later about his being instructed by a yogini or dakini, a female kind of magical female teacher who made arrows and taught him the meaning of reality through arrow making. But again, these are all later concoctions, and we really don't have much sense of what this person must have been like. He seems, if he refers to himself occasionally in his songs, and it's very clear he's quite self-confident, and he's kind of dismissive of fools. I've forgotten how I translated it here, but in another place, he more or less refers to his listeners as hicks. I can't tell you immediately what the original Indian term for that is, but it's like somebody who's real rustic, Anyway, we don't know much about him, but this poem at least is a little, gives you a little flavor. Yeah. Sure, go ahead.
Real quick, it seems like that poem could be read as a coded description of subtle body practices from a tantric perspective.
There's that suggestion, but there's undoubtedly some further tantric references in there, but figuring out exactly how you get from the painter and these particular flowers, it's a bit of a stretch, and because nobody's ever commented on it except people like me who've read it and translated it, and Tibetan tradition doesn't have you can't turn up some Sunday and hear a teaching on this. It's we do, yeah, but no, I think you're right that would be the direction to go with understanding it.
It's a lovely poem of invitation, I think. It kind of reminds me too of some of the Sufi poetry.
Oh yeah, well, the whole theme of the beloved in Sufi poetry too. Yeah, Hindu.
Inviting the beloved.
Right. Exactly. Anyway.
Yeah, so a little ecstatic feeling there, which I can get into. And I think not only did in one hagiography, one story of the origin of Saraha is the arrow one, and the other one is like this young woman who teaches him using radish soup, which we don't need to go into the details.
Oh, it's such a great.
Okay. One way or the other,
if there's time,
he's gonna wake up by some woman giving him a
yes, it's gonna be
help.
female, and he's got another thing coming.
Yeah, he's gonna be schooled.
Yeah.
So anyway, so much range in the text. So we have this, ecstatic poem you just read, and then other ones that, almost technical. Some that just this, series of sort of excoriations of other people's types of practice. So that's all it's fun. But anyway, we were gonna would you read a passage from the People Doha, which, as I understand it, is one of the most influential of his texts. Yes. I think we're looking at 278.
Yes, I do have it. Thanks. yeah, this is the people Doha, is what the Tibetans refer to it as. The traditions in India refer to it as the treasury of Dohas. Doha is a kind of, it's actually a meter, but more generally it's a verse form with particular rhythms, though the rhythms can vary, and it has end rhymes. So that's quite remarkable. And that, of course, you were mentioning that one language to another, the Tibetans can't pick up on the end rhymes, because it just that would be an extraordinary feat if they could, and that end rhymes are just not something that Tibetans do. They do a lot of alliteration, but end rhymes, no. Anyway, the People Doha is by far his most influential text. It's the one that we have. We actually have 3 or 4 different versions in Apabhramsha, the Indian language. There's a couple or 2 or 3 different Tibetan translations. So there's many versions of this text, some more standard, some less standard. And what I'm going to read here, I mean, he begins with the kind of excoriations that Ben was just referring to, but what I'm going to read is the very end of the text. And this is the section that at least a Tibetan commentator describes as fruition. So this is how the end of the path is imagined by Saraha. The sublime tree of non-dual mind grows over everything in the triple world. Flowers of compassion bear the fruit of benefiting others, and its name is supreme benefit to others. The sublime tree of emptiness sends forth flowers, which are the many varieties of sublime compassion. Its eventual fruit is spontaneously accomplished. This bliss is not just another mind state. The sublime tree of emptiness lacks compassion. It has no roots or flowers or leaves, but anyone who turns emptiness into a referent will fall down and break their limbs. 2 trees are within a single seed, and that's why the fruit is one. Anyone who thinks them indivisible is free from samsara and nirvana. And kind of shifting slightly. When a needy person comes around and leaves with their hopes unfulfilled, they'll pick up a clay cup tossed out the door. Better they should toss out the householder and take up residence. Not working to benefit others, not bestowing gifts on the needy. This, alas, is the fruit of samsara. Better you should toss out selfhood. So that's in pretty much every version of the People Doha. That's those the final 6 or 7 verses, and this extended image of the tree is quite remarkable. The Tibetan and the Apabhramsha differ in certain ways, but we don't need to worry about that particularly. I base my translations here on the Tibetan, actually. But this image of the single tree that blossoms forth compassion and various other qualities, but also because it really has maybe its root in emptiness more than anything else. And of course, emptiness negates all the things we might affirm, but another way to think of it is it simply clears the ground for the manifestation of all those qualities. So by emptying out your mind, say, that's the condition for the possibility of the blossoming of compassion. There's much more that could be said about that, but that's just a quick look at it. And the last 2 verses about basically throwing out selfhood and emphasizing compassion. A text that began with this kind of vicious critique of every religious tradition known to India, including Buddhism. Not just, it wasn't just after the Hindus and the Jains, though he had nasty things to say about them, but Buddhists as well. It's nothing escapes his arrow, I suppose. But he ends on this note of talking about compassion and selflessness, basically. And it's also a way of indicating that here's somebody who is, yes, he's a tantric Buddhist above all, probably, but he's deeply rooted in Mahayana Buddhism and notions of emptiness, compassion, the bodies of the Buddha, and so forth.
So, one thing that I noticed reading this book
freaky. There's some freaky stuff.
To use a technical term.
So freaky stuff. So I'm not all that familiar with tantric Buddhism. So there's practices that are either metaphorically or actually sexual that are described in detail, and all kinds of other things that I would say seem pretty transgressive relative to normal Buddhist ethics, the ones I'm familiar with from earlier Buddhist traditions. I'm wondering how should we look at or interpret or find value or critique of this kind of discourse that we see in this text?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question. It's not even. I mean, I think the context in which we have to understand Saraha is above all as a tantric Buddhist practitioner, particularly as a practitioner of the so-called yogini tantras, tantras that tend to emphasize the kind of equivalency between enlightenment and great bliss, for instance, and which also place a great premium on female imagery, female figures, including deities, and it seems perhaps flesh and blood women who might be engaged with one in these kinds of practices, which are described pretty explicitly in all sorts of tantric texts. But from the very beginning, the tradition has been uncertain, broadly speaking, as to how all this ought to be interpreted. There clearly were people who were engaged in such practices in the literal physical sense, if you will. We're talking about sexual practices because there's other elements of transgression as well, consumption of, urine and feces and things like that, which are a kind of a common theme in tantric traditions. You find the equivalents in Hindu tantra as well. But the whole question of how literally or figuratively this ought to be taken was debated in India, it was debated in Tibet, and I think that while I think there's very little question, but that people did practice these in a physical sense in some cases. You have to recognize that it not only exists within the context of something like yogini tantras, these kind of late Indian Buddhist tantras, but it exists within the larger world of Buddhism and Buddhist values. And so I think it's stressed in most of the texts, and it's certainly stressed with increasing frequency as the tradition develops, that you can't do this it's like, don't try this at home, okay? You cannot do this kind of thing unless you already have incredible discipline, renunciation, compassion, bodhicitta, to use the Sanskrit term for the altruistic aspiration to enlightenment. You have to have insight into emptiness. So you've actually got to have it really together if you're going to do these kinds of things. And in any case, quite that notwithstanding, increasingly as the tradition developed, and this is particularly true in Tibet, it's not the case always in Tibet, but mostly in Tibet, all this came to be seen as, for instance, visualized rather than physically enacted. And the kind of disgusting substances that people in India perhaps actually did consume as a way of getting beyond distinctions, getting beyond the duality of, pleasant, disgusting. I mean, there's a logic behind this that the tantric traditions broadly tended to adopt. But increasingly in Tibet, it was, and in some cases in India, it was seen as something to be taken on a visualized level, a symbolic level. And so, the union of male and female, which of course could be and sometimes was enacted physically, came to be symbolic of the union of skillful means and wisdom, to take an example. So I think, for our, even in the Tibetan cultural context, they were kind of like, most people should not, very few people are really qualified to do this. It's practices for the very end of the tantric path, which presumes all sorts of abilities that I sure don't have, and I'm guessing most people here don't have either. So that's the way it's kind of come down. But one has to recognize that in the actual historical cultural context of India and sometimes in Tibet, some of these things certainly did occur, and they sometimes occurred in the cases of people who really weren't qualified to do them, and this became itself a problem historically and religiously, especially in Tibet, where there were reformers having to come along all the time and say, when we talk about I've forgotten the exact Tibetan terms for these, but when we talk about liberation, we're not talking about killing people. When we're talking about joining, we're not talking about sex. People had to be kind of steered away from some overly enthusiastic, as somebody recently said, oh yeah, Tantra, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, it's just, it ain't.
Not quite it.
Not quite it, yeah.
So just a question about that. So the purpose of these practices, whether they're literal or metaphorical, is basically to finally destroy distinctions. That's why you went that far.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say that's the classic justification of it anyway. Yeah. Well, and certainly in the case of consuming so-called disgusting substances, meats and nectars, as they tend to put it. In the case of the sexual practices, that's all linked in with issues having to do with the subtle body, the movement of energies within the subtle body, and basically the attainment of Buddhahood. It's not that sex is required for the attainment of Buddhahood, but it can be and often is an important element of it. So people who are monastics often are said not to achieve full enlightenment in this lifetime because they would not take a physical partner. But again, there's disagreement on almost all of these points, and the kind of a domestication that happened over the centuries.
Okay, well, I got a couple things I want to ask you about, and then we're going to see if people here have questions. I would love it if you would read a brief passage from the key instructions. These are really great. There was one I really liked. There's something like, who painted the peacock? I don't know if I'm getting that right. You're going to find your version. But anyway, yeah, like a bird cannot fly out of the sky. So this is like a series of these just very brief aphoristic.
Yeah, this is a whole kind of genre. It's part of aphoristic would be a good word for it. You think, who was it? Was it La Rochefoucauld who had all these sayings? And I remember more recent, I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the work of Antonio Porcia, who was he was like an Argentine carpenter who did these amazing sayings, not necessarily connected to one another. Anyway, I was reminded of that in reading Saraha's key instruction. So it's a text that I think the full title of it includes the term Mahamudra or the Great Seal, but it's broken into 6 or 7 sections having to do with view, practice, fruition. These are kind of standard textual divisions, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. Anyway, without further ado, I'll just read you the first section, which is on the view, right, which is typically has to do with the view of emptiness. I bow down to glorious Heruka. There's Heruka again. The Dakini's blessing is a symbol of realization. And again, a Dakini is a female figure who assists in the gaining of wisdom, perhaps the gaining of power. Okay. The sesame illuminates the lamp. Be like medicine effected by mantras. The peacock's food is not for others. Sandal is the scent of the deer's musk gland. Waves of water are the sea itself. The nature of clarity is like white cotton. Though a mountain cannot be shaken, it is no different from glacier water. Garlic and its odor are not different. The quality of the sun and moon is clarity. Don't look for the tracks of a bird. The sky is not a topic for logical analysis. The dimensions of a mandala are symmetrical. A zombie is like a jewel in the world of activity. The wondrous crystal jewel is incomparable. So, I on one level, I defy you to interpret some of these individual sayings. I also, even more strongly, would defy you to establish a clear connection from one saying to the other, and yet they have been put together into these sections. This supposedly has to do with the view. You find other tantric poetry that is similarly kind of paradoxical might even be too scholastic a way of putting it. It's like this juxtaposition of sayings. It's almost like a stitch in time saves nine. A fool and his money are soon parted. You could do something like that, and it probably would have the same effect. I mean, there are some references there. I mean, the bird tracks in the sky, I think, is well known in Zen tradition as well, and probably they have common roots somewhere in Mahayana Buddhism, I'm sure. But they're not, again, they're not on an obvious level connected in any way, and yet and I'm not going to take the time to do it, and please don't ask me in the Q&A to try to do it, because I don't think I could, but let's just say that the religious imagination is fathomless and unbounded, and any of these taken on its own could be read as imparting the profoundest truth. And you just, in that sense, maybe they almost become something like koans. And I don't want to overstate it, because again, this like the Ornament of Springtime is not a text that anybody has really commented on. They were only brought to people's attention, 20 years or so ago, and they probably there's a whole question of authorship surrounding Saraha. I won't bore you with that, but these may well have been composed by their supposed translator, a great figure by the name of Padampa Sangye, anyway, Padampa Sangye was a transmitter of Indian Buddhism to Tibet and also to China in the 11th century, roughly speaking. And his own works are full of things like this. And he was very fond of teaching by gestures and by putting his hand over his mouth. Again, the kinds of things we are familiar with from Zen koan stories. So there's a little bit of that spirit. So again, it's quite possible that he was the actual author of this, and because Saraha was a figure to reckon with by the 11th century, attributed it to Saraha. And this may be the case with many of the songs of Saraha, that they were actually written by somebody else. And it's not just Western, kind of critical scholars who say this. The Tibetans had big fights over which of Saraha's texts were genuine and which had been concocted by some Nepali, So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to say the sky is not a subject for logical analysis. Good night.
Tell that to a meteorologist, but anyway.
Dang! So, the mind, often described as being like sky. The nature of mind is such a theme in these texts. The Mahamudra tradition bearing a lot of commonality with Zen, I would think, especially looking at the inherent luminously liberated nature that's naturally present in any mode of human consciousness. And so I would just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what these texts are saying about the nature of mind.
Yeah.
It's a big, huge topic.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. I mean, it's as I've suggested earlier, it's arguably the central theme of Saraha's teaching throughout all these songs. I mean, just two or three key points to highlight, and then we can open it up for broader discussion. And I think I've already kind of said this, but the first thing is that the nature of mind is that it is primordially pure, luminous, blissful, and empty. And if those can all somehow go together, then so much the better. But that's a kind of classic, that's classic in the Buddha nature literature, but it's certainly a key theme in tantric literature. And you know, the question, okay, so that's, okay, great, that's the nature of my mind, but the obvious follow-up to that is how do we get there, right? How do I realize this? As you say, it is present in some sense in every moment of consciousness, but most of us are, I think, unaware of it through most of our daily rounds, as it were. You know, you can talk about sort of more indirect and more direct routes to this. And again, Mahamudra, the Great Seal, is simply the realization of the actual nature of one's mind and methods for attaining that. And these can range from, you know, kind of a classic, very long-lasting Buddhist path that begins with, you know, developing renunciation and the altruistic aspiration to enlightenment or bodhicitta, understanding emptiness, following various bodhisattva practices, and then eventually, you know, coming into tantric, the various levels of tantric practice, which themselves can be very gradual. You know, there's so-called lower and so-called higher tantras, and the higher tantras, you know, even if you can visualize a mandala with 722 deities for 4 hours straight in such detail that you can see the pupils of the eyes of every one of them, you're not there yet. That's just the prerequisite for getting into these subtle body practices that really begin to get at the nature of mind in a profound way. And in a way, Mahamudra, the Great Seal, is the outcome of all of this. But there are some who would say, well, why do we have to go through all that? You know, why all the rigmarole? Why all the ritual? Why all the visualization? If the nature of mind is right there with us, right now, just see it. And there's you know, there's elements in Saraha that clearly are talking about these more gradual practices, more traditional Buddhist ideas, but a fair amount of his rhetoric also is, you know, just see it. Don't drop conceptuality, drop your practices, just see the nature of your mind. And in that way, there's at least one of the voices of Saraha is one that says, you know, anything you try is not going to get it. So you, in a way, you almost have to stop trying, just drop it all, and there it'll be, because there it is after all. So, I mean, that's at least one way of coming at this. You know, I mean, if we were going to talk about this in a more modern context, I know we could start talking about human potential and things like that, but I'll leave that to others to discourse on. So that's a quick version of it anyway. And again, this is a very common notion in. I mean, the notion of mind being luminous actually goes back to the early traditions. There's a passage in the Pali Canon that says, the nature of mind, O monks, is luminous, and its defilements are simply temporary or accidental. So it's a very old idea in Buddhism, and it's just, then in Mahayana, they really pick up on it. Then in Tantra, they really, really pick up on it. And then somebody like Saraha comes along and says, oh, but it's right there. Just see it.
Don't waste time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, we want to leave some time for folks to ask questions, or, yeah, anybody want to bring a voice?
Or argue, or.
Yeah, argue. We love that.
Excoriate.
How do you decide what translation to use when you use, say, mind rather than consciousness? how do you deal with that?
I try in general, I mean, I've had to face this, because a lot of what I've translated seems to involve mind somehow, it being Buddhism. I try to be relatively consistent. I mean, the word that I'm translating as mind is generally chitta, which has a technical sense in Abhidharma Buddhism, where it refers, they talk about chitta and chaita. Chitta is sort of the main mind in any moment of awareness that simply is aware of whatever the object of awareness is. And then there are various accompanying minds, mental factors.
So would you translate chitta matra in Yogacara as mind only rather than consciousness only?
Yes, because the term that is, I mean, this is a little technical, but the term that is most often translated as consciousness is vijnana.
Vijnana.
Yeah, and that's of course an alternative name for the Yogacara.
Yeah.
So there's, I mean, it used to be an old thing, I don't know if this is really politically correct, but it used to be said that, you know, that the Inuit had like 50 words for snow. It's like the Buddhists have, you know, 75 words for mind. So yeah, it's just, you have to sort of decide. I try to be consistent so that if a person who's reading this sees mind, they'll know that the equivalent is chitta. And I have changed my translations over the years in some cases for different things, but yeah. I mean, I
just want to follow this up with just one
Sure.
technical thing since I've got it on my mind. I'm teaching Dogen at Zen Center right now. And first we've got the preeminence of the body and the mind not being in any way separate from the body mind. And it's the body. Then in the next chapter we have the mind. So I've been using the translation consciousness because then I can deal with the disparity between what Dogen says in one place and another. But what do you think about that? Because consciousness includes body and mind.
I'm not sure that in the usual Buddhist usage, again, this is just based on what I've seen, that they can be identified that closely. I mean, yes, mind and body. I mean, I've done a lot of stuff on Dharmakirti in the past, who has the classic Buddhist argument for past and future lives based on discussion of the mind-body problem, and he makes it very clear, and I think this is kind of the classic Buddhist view, that mind and body are definite. But again, this is getting philosophical. Dogen is, you know, I would be very hesitant to. Dogen is deep. And not that Dharmakirti isn't deep, but it's a different kind of deep.
So
but Dharmakirti's point
I
is,
either have to say, oh, there's a paradox here, there's a contradiction, or I can use
well, for
the word
Dharmakirti, it's not a paradox. It's mind and body are both substances, not in the physical sense, but substances in the sense of real entities, or actually momentary sets of entities that affect each other. Mind can affect body, body can affect mind. They do not effect each other. Neither can be the cause of the other.
Right.
So there's that much distinction. Otherwise, the materialists win, and there's no rebirth.
Anyway, I didn't mean to go too far.
No.
I just had it on my mind because I was teaching Dogen last night.
Yeah.
Oh, this is my easy way out. So that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I try to base it as best I can on the language, the original languages. But if you're, you know, and well, you've got access to lots of good Dogen translations, I'm sure. And,
Okay.
So without knowing more about the context, I'm really hesitant to comment one way or the other.
Well, I noticed we've got just a couple minutes left on the clock, so if someone wants to bring a question.
I just want to say real quick, I was so excited when I saw you guys were going to talk tonight because seeing, you know, the study of enlightened outbursts is really interesting to me. And you see this throughout the history of Buddhism. Somebody says something or does something to wake somebody up. And Saraha is trying to wake us up with his poems, and it's very inspiring to me. And seeing you guys come together and your individual works, also coming together, it really promises a very fruitful discussion that's non-sectarian and helps us to sort of take a look at Buddhism as a whole and find the common outbursts of enlightenment that are really universal in tradition. So for me, it's inspiring to see that. Meeting your minds together.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, do you want to say anything in closing before we go into the book?
No, I'm good. I mean, if you do.
I can just say thank you.
Yeah.
Saraha! Saraha! Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work. You obviously work a lot to get this book ready, so thank you for your work to bring this avail, make this.
Yeah. No, it was a lot of fun, except when it wasn't.